Thank you to Adam Bachkar for inviting me, and thank you also to Andrei and Anna for organizing the space. Thank you everyone for coming. It's been actually 20 years since I last was in Prague, so a lot of things have changed, but it's fantastic to be back. When I was talking with Adam about what I would be talking today, we were thinking at first to do something which is what is advertised. This is just to say it's false advertising in the end. A history of world building. That's because that's what I'm writing about at the moment, although it's usually restricted to the Mediterranean. I will say more about that in a moment. But then I realized that since it's the first time that we meet, it would be a bit premature to start straight away with the history of world building without maybe saying a little bit about what I understand as worlds, world building, reality. So I thought that it would be easier maybe to have a more personal history of world building as a form of introduction into these ideas, touching in part also on what I'm writing at the moment on the Mediterranean. And then hopefully, which for me is always the best part of these situations, if you would like to have a conversation later, a discussion, that would be fun. The running thread in a way would be video games for various reasons. Just out of curiosity, anybody here is a video game designer? Or plays, or works with video games as an artist? Nobody. I don't believe it. Okay. I trust that many people at least play video games. And I will talk starting with a general introduction on worlds and their relationship with reality. And then moving on to two directions that we can take. One is how we can change ideas about world building, so changing the design of worlds, and then how we can overcome the idea of worlds, how we can escape worlds. And then ending with the few kind of solid foundations that you can take after an exploration into metaphysics of worlds and of reality. It'll be maybe 45 minutes, not too long, but hopefully then we can talk. So, since it's a personal history of world building, I would like to start with a personal anecdote from a childhood memory. When I was a kid, my parents encouraged me to read anything, any sort of book, with one exception, comics. My parents are loving parents, but they are high school teachers, and they had this distrust of comics, which is kind of strange. At that time, already Umberto Eco had justified comics as a real thing, but the idea was that I would be only looking at the images and not read the words. At the same time, I was allowed to buy comics, which is one of the strange blind spots in parenting that I'm discovering myself as a parent, but anyway. So I could buy these comics, and then to read them, I would usually hide in the bathroom and read them. And those were the years in the early 90s when another thing arrived, much to my parents' displeasure, which was the arrival of the first video games that you can play in the house. In America, they were already popular, but in Italy, in the early 90s, they started to be a thing. And so they were even more against the idea of video games, of course, being even more distracting. They were not entirely wrong, of course. And so I would go to my friends' houses to play the first video games, which I got my hands on: Street Fighter, Prince of Persia, so combat games, sport games, racing games. I liked them because they were forbidden, but also I liked them because I liked them. But really what really got me into video games, sorry, there's a bit of echo, maybe it's a bit too loud, is when I got my own computer at last, and I could finally play the games that I wanted, which were strategy video games. That was the time of, you might know these archaeological relics, at least the older among you. Command and Conquer, Age of Empires, Civilization. Those were the games that I used to really, really love. And I spent hours on end, especially at night, playing them. What I really liked about them, and I would be curious to know if you have played them, if you maybe like the same things, was that you had this world, which was a real world, and it was, it was a real place. And after many hours, after 10, 20, 30, 50 hours playing them, you know that world really very well. It's like a place where you've been, and you go back into them, and you organize things. So I liked very much this idea of organizing. I didn't like too much the fighting with the others, which was inevitable, it's in the nature of the game, but the organization of all the resources felt very natural, and the world itself, with its music, especially Civilization, I remember, was really very immersive. And when I got older, many years later, I had a similar experience with other games. For example, the early GTA, San Andreas, you might remember, once again, archaeological relic, 2004. I remember much later in life, during a period of depression, going to drive into San Andreas with the car, you can put the radio on, and it was a holiday. You know, like the day had been bad, but then I could just drive through this endless, almost endless, felt endless, countryside with the music. Now, that's the thing that really fascinates still me about video games, how immersive they are, even when they are the early Civilization or the early San Andreas, not phantasmagorical graphics, and how they feel really real, how the experience of being inside them is an experience of embodiment in another world, which is fictional, but feels entirely real. So games give you this possibility of being a bit like books, but more enhanced maybe, of being many people in many worlds, one after the other, of entering character, exiting character, and experiencing this being, like Pessoa would say, you know, like being everyone at the same time. This is something, by the way, if this is something that interests you, there is a philosopher called Stefano Gualeni from the University of Malta that writes very beautifully about this experience of enrolling and de-rolling in video games. So, growing up, this is a bit of an autobiographical bit, I kept this experience in mind also when I entered high school and I started to learn about philosophy. This kind of experience, when you study philosophy, unless you do it on a very dry basis, but you tend to approach it with some personal questions and some personal experiences that guide you a little bit. And I remember studying Plato at the beginning, as you do as a teenager in Italy. What impressed me the most wasn't, in part, this wonderful idea of the multi-layered reality with a world of forms, and above them, for the Neoplatonists, the one, and so on, which influenced me later in life. But at that time, the thing that really stuck with me was his way of showing us that, well, to say it as a video game player, that yes, video games are not the real reality. They are a much simplified, artificial version of reality. But, Plato would contend, so is this. Also, this is a much reduced, artificial shadow of reality as it really is. So I got from Plato, from this perspective, on a personal level, this lesson of skepticism towards reality as it appears to us. You don't have to take Plato's, even less so my word for it. It's just something that you can very easily grasp in a moment thinking about it. You know that, of course, what we see, what we perceive in any possible way, depends on the way in which we are structured as perceiving organisms. So, for example, different animals perceive different wavelengths of color. We perceive some different wavelengths of sound. We perceive things in particular ways depending on the way we are set up physically and cognitively. Kant would say we perceive things in space and time, for example. But this does not mean that the way in which we perceive reality is the way reality really is. It would take an immense leap of faith to believe that by a miracle, somehow the universe was created to coincide exactly with the specific limitations that we humans have. Skepticism is necessary, and the idea of taking things as they appear to us, not as reality as it is, but in the best case scenario as a very much reduced version, which is specific to our limits, and on top of that, an artificial version, like a video game. An artificial version because all these perceptions that we have, which are filtered by us, then we reconstruct them in our mind. This room that you're seeing outside of you, you're actually seeing inside, obviously, right? But, which is also always very strange when you stop for a moment and start thinking about it. But it's not just the perceptions that we organize, but it's also the meaning of these perceptions, the way in which we separate things, we give names to things, we order the perception space, we order the perception of time. We reorganize them depending on cultural values, on our upbringing, on our preferences, on our biological setup as well. So we make a cosmos. And this is a word that often returns in Greek mythology more than as well as philosophy and science. The three are difficult to distinguish sometimes, especially in certain moments. So we have a cosmos, and the cosmos is the ordered space of the world. In fact, cosmic, that's to refer to the universe in the same way that cosmetics refer to something beautiful, because this is the kind of world where we can live, the cosmos. And then, of course, I asked myself, well, but yeah, I play a video game, and then I de-roll, and I am back in my room, unfortunately. But then what if I de-roll from the room? Where do I go? So if the world itself is an artificial, limited construction, if we de-roll from that, we go to where? And here, once again, philosophy comes, giving to a video game player that has this question, giving a suggestion. Reading Heraclitus, you see that, for example, when he discusses things in his usual, very difficult, very poetic, really wonderful style. It's Plato and Heraclitus are two things that I very much recommend anyone to read. Plato, because he's a wonderful read, is a very good writer, is the first philosopher that writes without footnotes. Imagine that. And Heraclitus, because he's one of the best poets, I think, ever. But when he talks, for example, in one of the fragments about the fact that the way up and the way down are one and the same, which sounds a bit like a stupid proverb, what he's trying to say is that beyond our way of ordering things, reality is beyond distinctions. This is the same idea that you find in the Renaissance when they talk about the coincidence of opposites, coincidentia oppositorum. You find it in Nicholas of Cusa, in Pico della Mirandola. So the reality as it really is, whatever it is certainly beyond the way in which we order it. It's not cosmos, it's chaos. Chaos is another word that you find at the beginning of the Theogony of Hesiod, for example. In the beginning was chaos, and from chaos everything else. For the Egyptians was the same. In the beginning was Nun, this infinite, this extent of water, and from Nun, in the beginning was Tiamat, say the Babylonians, this enormous water monster, and so on. Chaos is, well, chaos is difficult, and it's not somewhere where you want to be, in a sense, although you are in it. But it's not a hellish landscape. Chaos is simply reality at an overwhelming level of intensity. It's beyond the way in which we can apprehend it. That is chaos. But where is chaos? It's exactly right here. Right here, in this moment of this, what's happening around us, we have a minuscule fragment of perception, which is even further restricted by the way in which we order it. But right here, all around, a lot more is happening. There is, all around our cosmos, in this exact moment, chaos is expanding infinitely in this very space. It's even more disturbing if you consider that the same applies to each of us. When you consider yourself, what you can perceive of yourself, once again, is very, very limited, to your perceptive abilities, and then your preferences, your setup, and so on and so forth. But you yourself, as you really are, so to say Wallace Stevens, things as they really are, for the vast majority you exist in chaos. And for a fragment of yourself, you exist in cosmos. The bit that you can see, that you can perceive, that you can imagine is cosmos. And a lot more exists. Now, well, this is a typical, this de-rolling exercise you can also do yourself. Actually, playing a video game is useful because it gets you in the mood. You play it, and you de-roll into the room. You try to de-roll from the room into yourself, closing your eyes. Then you try to de-roll from yourself, from the ego, so to say, into the self. And then you try to de-roll from the self itself. Okay? If you manage to accomplish this, you're one of the greatest mystics in the world. Okay? But the journey is in this direction. Now, returning to video games. I think there is a, I mean, I'm partisan here because I like strategy video games, but I think there is a link between worlds and strategy video games. Because in those kind of games, which I am assuming everybody knows, but it, you know, as I said, is a world where you organize resources, you tend to accumulate, sometimes you have to fight, but it's mostly about organizing. The way it is set up, that world, is everything is very neatly organized, everything has a name, everything has clear connections with each other. And your role is to administer, organize, and govern these resources all around you. The world itself, as we construct it, is very, very similar. So the world that surrounds us, what you can see around yourself right now, it's tidily separated entities. This cup is not this table, it's not me, with different names, with different moments in time, with memories distinguished from things, with imaginations distinguished from matter. It's the product of our mental design. Okay? It's the way in which we organize all the perceptions that invest us in the same way that a video game designer organizes a world. And the aim of our organization of the world is similar to the aim of the organization of a strategy video game. The point is that you can administer it, you can organize it, you can use the resources, you can distinguish this glass of water, you can take it and you can drink it, you can distinguish different things that might be bad or good for you. It's about administration of the cosmos. This is the point of this organization. That's why we call it beautiful. Because it makes us powerful, because it makes us, you know, not powerful in a crazy way, but powerful enough that we can preserve certain forms, we can, you know, control things. Similarly, also to ourselves, the reason why we call ourselves with a name, we give ourselves an identity, is similarly so that we have a clear idea of who we are, we can administer our boundaries better, we can govern ourselves better. If you wish, this construction of the world, this basic level of organization that we have of our mental design, is the ground zero of technology. This is the fundamental technology. It's where technology comes from, in a sense. There was a French philosopher called Gilbert Simondon that had a very interesting way of understanding technology, not just as the technical objects themselves, but as that process through which different entities individuate themselves, create themselves as individuals, separate from other things, and individuate them as well. To do this, they use technical objects. You know, technical objects are the things that separate and connect and create differences. In a way, your own name is the first technical object that you have, or your own identity, as separate from somebody else. That's why it's so interesting to observe, for example, a child separating themselves, usually from the mother, at a very early stage, and creating this first technical object, which is self-perception. Of course, doing this is not for free and has a trade-off. So on the one hand, we have the comfort of feeling in control of this big strategy video game in which we are immersed. And also we have the idea of being something specific, you know, me. On the other hand, we have to pay something in exchange. On the one hand, we have to renounce a bigger idea of reality, a more authentic perception of things as they are. So we take comfort, but in exchange we give knowledge. You know, we have to renounce this close relationship with cows. We have to really keep it out of the door. But also we renounce, you know, we get comfort, but we also get anxiety at the same time, strangely. Why? Because we start having automatic mechanisms. Whenever we start seeing things that slip outside of the cosmos, so we can no longer observe them, we can no longer distinguish them from the rest, they die, so to say, we give for granted that they disappear from reality. Okay? So we have a very phobic relationship with this disintegration of things. And that's the price we have to pay. They don't necessarily disappear ontologically, so that we cannot say that they have actually exited reality, if that is possible at all. But because they exited the cosmos, that gives us a sense of absolute loss. So we have comfort and anxiety, okay, which is a typical, I think in our society we are very used to this combination. The two go very well together usually. So I think that the video games are very reductive. Of course, it's a simplified version of reality, and reductionist is the way in which they are organized. But I think they're very useful for us to remember that even this is a very reductive understanding of reality as it really is. Specifically, the way in which we think we know things, the way in which we name things and separate them in the institutions that we build around them, of course. So from this general, long but necessary introduction, I think we can move, now it's the shorter part, in two directions. On the one hand, trying to see how we can intervene on this design of worlds. I make this constant comparison with video games, of course, because the point is the design of them. With a video game, you know that you can change it. Can we change this design around us? Spoiler, yes. The second direction that we can take is if it is possible to exit worlds or into a bigger idea of reality. Is it possible? To what extent? We'll see. Okay. So let's start with the first direction, how we can modify the design of worlds. And I'll stay once again with video games, because after many years spent just playing them, and after a few university degrees to give myself an air of respectability, I finally did a PhD on video game design. I did a PhD on metaphysics and metaethics in the design of strategy video games. So briefly, the point was, I took one in particular, one which is called Total War Rome. It's a video game from a few years ago. And I took this one as a case study, and I analyzed how this video game, in the way in which it is set up by the designers, who are presumably not metaphysicians, is set up according to metaphysical choices. They had to decide whether reality was built in a certain way or in another, whether time flew according to one metaphysical theory or another, whether things existed materially and immaterially, whether universals existed, how possible worlds were structured, and so on and so forth, the typical elements of traditional metaphysics. And then the second part was to show how we could modify these parameters, and by modifying them, the games would change entirely. So that a video game designer, to invent a new game, wouldn't have just to get very stoned and imagine something else, but could also, on top of that, just modify the metaphysical parameters of the existing games and see what happens. So that's, and I showed all the different variations. That's why it took me a while to finish it. On top of that, I built a video game myself called Lamassu. I did it with a designer, of course, Jelena Viskovic, that did the software engineering. Lamassu is a name that you might have heard if you are into Babylonian mythology, if you've gone to museums of Assyrian antiquities. You know that bull with the back of a lion, the head of a human with a big beard, and the wings of an eagle. If you Google it, you'll see it. That is the original image of the cherubim. Cherubims are the little angels, kind of chubby with wings. The original cherubim is Lamassu. Okay? It's an enormous monster that was protecting heaven and so on. Lamassu is the name of the game because Lamassu is 4 animals in one. Incidentally, for people who are interested in iconography of religion, the 4 animals that a Lamassu is, let's see if anybody gets it. Eagle. Esatto. Yeah, it's taken from there. In London, nobody gets it. It's fantastic. So the video game was built as the same reality that is experienced by 4 different characters as 4 different worlds. They are invisible to each other, but they influence each other. That was to show also to what extent different hypotheses about how reality is built lead to incompatibility or incommunicability between different groups or different people. You have this often when you have conversations between a person, for example, that grew up in a traditional tribe in the Amazonian forest and a person that grew up in Silicon Valley in California. Sometimes there is a real difficulty to share the same worldview in the most fundamental sense. They're not talking about the same reality at all. So the point there was, of course, to show how by changing metaphysical assumptions, you can create authentically new video games, but more importantly, you can, by changing metaphysical assumptions here, we can create authentically new worlds. This idea, of course, is not mine. I didn't come up with it as the first person. It is part of, well, in other ways it's discussed in philosophy under the term of perspectivism. Perspectivism is the notion that there are no things or events that are in a particular way in themselves, but they are authentically different depending on how you interpret them, on different interpretation, different access points. It's also an idea that you find in anthropology. I mentioned earlier somebody growing up in a traditional tribe in the Amazon forest, and actually the cosmology that you find in many parts of the Amazon forest, which is very large, of course, in the more eastern part, is similar to this. It was studied beautifully and described by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who is an anthropologist from Brazil. And in a book called Cannibal Metaphysics, he explains how the Amerindian, as he calls it, worldview, is something similar to what I've discussed so far. He calls it multinaturalism. What does it mean? We are used to saying multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is the idea that reality, the world is one, the material reality is one. What changes is the different cultures of the people, the different points of awareness that inhabit it. So there's your point of awareness, mine, and so on, but the world is the same for everyone. Multinaturalism is the idea that there is one form of awareness. The one of the jaguar, of the toucan, of the salamander, of you, of the tree is the same, is numerically identical. It's the same awareness that sees through different bodies, and by seeing through different bodies inhabits different worlds. So there is multinaturalism. One culture, many natures, many realities. This is also interesting if, in case you're interested in this part. It's not entirely dissimilar from an old philosophical tradition that you find in Andalusia in the 12th and 13th century with a philosopher called Ibn Rushd, in Latin Averroes. He also theorized the idea that all our different minds are actually just one, seeing different worlds depending on the different bodies. So this was not, of course, my idea. It's something that you can find all around. But one thing that I think is important to point out, apart from the history of philosophy, is that this notion that, in a way, we construct the world around ourselves, and by changing metaphysical assumptions, by changing theories that we adopt to construct it, to structure it, to organize it, beliefs about time, about identities, about space, and so on, well, this has a political consequence as well. Why? Well, you notice it very well in video games. Depending on how you structure a certain world, on the basis of certain metaphysical ideas, certain actions become possible or impossible. Certain entities become possible or impossible. Similarly, in the world around us, depending on how we believe its fundamental metaphysics, certain things become possible or impossible. Certain actions become foolish, superstitious, as we call the actions that no longer fit our worldview, or reasonable. Think, for example, about the fact that we have a war between two nations or two states depends on the metaphysical assumption that the nation or the state exists. I've never seen a state anywhere, but of course, this is a metaphysical belief. Without that metaphysical belief, the thing it becomes impossible. In the same way that without the metaphysical belief about the divine design of the world, certain things that you find in the Middle Ages became impossible. So at the political, but most importantly at the pre-political level, modifying the metaphysics of the world has a very strong impact on the kind of politics that are possible or impossible. I think also feminism offers a good example of how a political movement has metaphysical basis. In fact, which then developed, for example, you find a good evolution in queer theory, challenging certain metaphysical entities like genders, the way they are specifically characterized, is not just a political thing, but it's a pre-political metaphysical transformation. Then, of course, if we go this way, how do we do this? How do we challenge and transform the fundamental assumptions about the world? Well, there is the work of hegemony. as Gramsci used to call it, of cultural hegemony. So challenging the discourse about things, the common sense, not the big theories in the university, but the common sense about how things are. The hidden metaphysical assumptions that we have, transforming them and challenging them. You can do it hegemonically in a soft way with new narrations and new ways of explaining the world, which have to become, once again, those narrations that talk about the structure of reality. Mythology, for example, something that we have stopped doing for a long time, which was, I think, a bad mistake. Now, restarting at this level of a grand narrative, a cosmology that restructures what we believe to be part of the world or not. They will all be fake anyway, you know, they will all be artificial anyway, but they will produce completely different spaces of the possible. And then, of course, there is the hard job of hegemony at a political level in a more solid Gramscian form, of course. So I've continued to look into this also in, sorry, let me see how we're doing with time. Okay, I'll keep it short. This kind of work on reality and on world building can also be used not only in the more muscular Gramscian way of hegemony, but also sometimes in terms of an emergency world building. What does it mean, an emergency world building? It happens sometimes in history that the way in which the world is structured, for some reason, doesn't include you, for various reasons. Okay? And this leads to horrific political consequences, of course. These horrific political consequences deserve to be fought at the political level and at the level of bare survival. But at the same time, as you're undergoing that, there is a difficulty, because then you find yourself somehow like an ontological exile. You know, you're no longer part of reality for some reason. You're completely out. How do you respond to that? Emergency world building is the ability in these kind of situations, as well as struggling for survival and, or possibly, if you can, politically struggling to reopen a space, to engage in world building once again and to invent new ways of seeing reality that you immediately adopt, you know, as a way in which you remake sense of reality in a way that includes you. Now, this is something that's been done over and over and over again throughout history. And in fact, the book that Adam was mentioning earlier is a book that I'm writing at the moment, and is a history of this form of emergency world building in the part of the world where I am from, so the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean region, you know there have been many civilizations, but what is usually mentioned a little bit less, each one of them fell. Okay? And every single peak that you see is followed by a series of nadirs. How did people cope with these constant catastrophes, which are authentic apocalypses, in the sense that certain worlds, certain ideas of reality are annihilated? I trace a history of these emergency forms of world building, which you find from the Bronze Age, with the first intermediate period in Egypt, through Hellenism, the destruction of the great Persian Empire, which was a completely unique way of seeing the world, through the fall of the Roman Empire and the first persecutions, through the persecutions of the Jews and the Muslims in early modernity, and so on and so forth, all the way to today. The point there is not to substitute emergency world building for political action, but to remind that even at the very worst moments, when politically one is entirely powerless, which can happen while we fight, when we wait for the revolution of tomorrow, you know, there are long stretches of time in which we are powerless, it is still possible then to reconstruct. When it's impossible to change anything in the world, it's still possible to transform entirely the world, at least in a personal metaphysical narration or in a group narration. And that is not an escapist fantasy, but it is an activity that has solid metaphysical foundations, solid philosophical foundations, and that is also necessary, in a sense, because otherwise you cannot. Outside of the cosmos, it's very difficult to live, unless you are a mystic. And that's the last part. Is it possible to get out of the cosmos? Well, in a sense, we already are part of the cosmos. The vast majority of who we are, each of us, is mostly in the chaos and minimally in the cosmos. But our awareness seems to have difficulties perceiving it by definition, because it's that thing which exceeds our awareness. there are some specialists that have tried to, pursue the philosophical necessity of trying to see the limits of our understanding. These specialists are not scientists, neither philosophers, but they are mystics. The mystics are the psychonauts, so the travelers of the psyche, if you wish, that specialize in this, in the attempt to overcome the limitations of the mind and of the body and of the imagination, which in certain forms are different and certain similar, and see what's beyond. Now, the problem, however, is that the mystics sometimes write and explain what they do and what they see, but unless you go through the same exact experience, which sadly I have not done, so I cannot report back, but what you get is very little. The mystical writing is fascinating, but the point of mysticism is to not write. The muein, the root of the word mystic, has to do with shutting the eyes, shutting the mouth. Same root as mystery. What they usually write, when you read mystical treatises, for example, they have this approach which is called negative theology. They don't tend to say what it is that they see, but they tend to say what it isn't. Negative theology is the way of talking about something that exceeds your understanding, so chaos, by reminding you of all the things that it is not. So you have even forms of negative theology that say that of God you cannot say anything. Not that he exists, not that he or she or they or it is great or good, because that would be limiting it. Okay? So these are very interesting. They sound like blasphemous treatises, but they are in fact negative theological treatises. So what can we get from these writings, from mystical writings, apart from the head rush of reading some of them, which is exhilarating, but for personal use? Well, I think we can get something which is once again similar to the skepticism we can get from Plato. Incidentally, after Plato died, his school became the school of skepticism, and that's the academy became skeptic. The idea, of course, by reading mystical treatises that tell you what's beyond the worlds, you can get that you have to suspend judgment about metaphysical statements. You cannot say for certain anything about the world as it appears to you. What does it mean? It means that you have to suspend judgment on a number of metaphysical things that we take as absolutely matter-of-fact true. The definition of life, for example. The definition of life that we have is a minuscule fragment of what it is. Can we take that as the absolute reality? No. Okay? We have to suspend judgment on what life fundamentally is. Which also means the definition of death. We are used as common sense nowadays to understand death in a particular way, okay, which has to do with the corrupting of the body, the stop of movements, and so on and so forth. But that has to do simply with what we can observe within the cosmos. Is death a phenomenon outside of the cosmos, in chaos? Probably not. Most likely not. And even less so, the common sense that we have, the idea of nothingness. The notion of nothingness itself, which we usually attribute as the idea of what is after death, as well as any other fantasy that we might have about what happens after death, they are minuscule fragments of our specific imagination built to coincide with our cognitive limits. Whatever is beyond death is most likely not any of the things that we can think of, including nothingness. Nothingness is a fantasy of the human. It's not a matter of reality. Parmenides is very good on this. So, to close, what can we get? So, there's absolutely nothing that we can know for certain. No, there is something that we can say for certain about reality. And that we can use maybe to ground our activity of world building, as well as on the crisis of the moment in which either of us can be living, but also on some particularly solid foundations from which we can start this fictional work of world building. What do we know? Well, there was a philosopher of the 11th century. He was from Uzbekistan, moved to Persia. The Uzbek call him the Uzbek philosopher, the Iranians call him an Iranian philosopher. Matter of fact, he was one of the greatest philosophers that ever lived. His name was Ibn Sina, Avicenna. Avicenna, at some point in his life, Avicenna was a really unpleasant man, but a genius. At some point in his life, he had been kidnapped by a local nobleman that wanted him in his court. That was the time when philosophers got kidnapped. I wish. And so he was kept in this tower. And in this tower, to kill time, he proceeded with a thought experiment. We are in the 11th century. Yeah? I'm saying this because this thought experiment returns with Descartes 500 years later. But the original is here. The thought experiment is, imagine you were born mid-air, you're floating. It's called the floating man argument. You're a floating person, born mid-air, you have no memories. Your limbs don't touch. You know nothing at all. What do you know? So you have no perceptions. There's no air, no taste, no sound, no nothing. Your eyes are closed. You don't feel anything. You don't know anything. You don't remember anything. Is there anything that you know? And he said, yeah, you know that you exist. Why do you know it? Because awareness and existence in us coincide. This is something that you find also in mystical treatises, the idea that the knower, the known, and the act of knowing coincide in one. What does this mean? It means that we know for certain that even though everything might be illusory in its shape and in its form, existence is. That existence is. It's difficult to say any more than this without breaking the rules of negative theology. And we know that existence is and is aware. How do we know it? Because of nothing we can be certain. Even of our own body. It's just a bunch of sensations. But what we know is that we are aware, and we are. This is the fragment that we can hold on to. You know, remember in the never-ending story, there is only a fragment of a world that remains, okay? It's a little bit like that. From that one we can start, but we can add another one, which we know for certain. That existence is and is aware, and that it's susceptible, that it can feel impressions that give joy or suffering. Joy or suffering are ontologically real phenomena. Okay, they might be attached to ontologically illusionary things, but they are real. So, where do we go from here? From here, you can start from this very minimal foundation. You can start, well, if you wish, you can start following Buddhism, which is a religious tradition that starts from very similar viewpoints, or Advaita Vedanta in forms of non-dualist Hinduism, or the old works of Parmenides, or maybe Spinoza, and so on and so forth. You can go in many directions. But I think that from here you can also start in a much more modest way, because we are talking here about design of world building. You can start moving towards any project of world building that I think holds a few items as important in the design. And I will close with this. A form of world building that is based on the notion of the commonality of awareness. All that we know about reality, the only thing of reality of which we can predicate existence, the only way in which we experience existence is awareness. The only thing that we know for certain exists is our own awareness. As far as we know, existence is awareness. What does it mean? It means that whenever you construct a world, it is illicit, metaphysically, to predicate the reality of natural separations between various degrees of awareness, things that have no awareness or more or less awareness. This is important because this idea of the non-commonality of awareness, the fact that some people have it, some people have it more, some people have it less, some things are completely dumb, it's the origin of many species and racist discourses that we found. It's the metaphysical origin. But this is ungrounded. The second thing that we can hold is that although we have to create a cosmos made of linguistic institutions, of imaginary divisions and separations, we cannot take them as real. We need them, we need the cosmos, but we have to be careful never to believe it, which is very strange. It's exactly like a game. It's a world that exists as far as you believe it, while always remembering that it's not existent. The moment you forget it, that's what is called, for example, in Islam, is very much pointed as the problem of idolatry. Yeah, that is the idolatry. Believing that things are as you can say them. Ibn Arabi, a great Sufi mystic, talks about the fact that if you believe that God is Allah, is idolatry, which sounds paradoxical from the Muslim Sufi mystics. But it's exactly the point. We need linguistic institutions. If we believe them real, we make a terrible mistake, which is usually in the name of this linguistic institution we have perpetrated some of the worst crimes that have been done ever. And finally, that if we are looking for, we've only been talking about metaphysics here, but is there any space for ethics? Ethics is a decision about good and bad. Ethics is the decision about what things are good, what things are bad. Below ethics, there is meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is the discussion of, when you say good or bad, what do you mean? You mean something you don't like? Or you mean something that is against God's plan? You mean something that is unnatural? You mean something that your community says is wrong? Meta-ethics is very, very interesting as a field. I think in this point, the only guiding way, meta-ethically, that we can derive from this is that joy and suffering, as experienced by the individual points of awareness, it's the only guiding line that we have, fundamentally. Okay? So at that minimum level, alleviating suffering and expanding joy at that minimum level, not at the level of the linguistic construction, not saving the motherland or whatever, saving the market or whatever else you can invent. But at that minimal level, that is the only guiding line that we have, because it's grounded on the very, very few ontological things that we can say for certain. Okay, thank you for your patience. So fun. Thank you.